And if you're all okay, I guess we can start, if everybody's on board. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the technical characteristics of attribution. How do you know who did it? A webinar organized jointly by the Washington Foreign Law Society and the Stimson Center. I am Michael Todori, president of the Washington Foreign Law Society, and WFLS was founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, comparative legal issues, and foreign law. And our co-host today is the Stimson Center. Stimson is a leading voice on urgent and global issues. As power and technology usher in a challenging new era, Stimson is at the forefront, engaging new voices, generating innovating ideas and analysis, and building solutions to promote international security, prosperity, and justice. This event is part of a series of events that we've organized jointly with Stimson to discuss and examine legal accountability in cyberspace. And as I was mentioning earlier, if you want to catch the other events that we've done, just go on our website, WFLS.org, and you can just watch the recordings. They're very interesting. I do encourage you to follow the previous episodes. Today's event will be moderated by Dr. Christopher Ford. Chris is a MITRE Fellow and Director of MITRE Corporation's Center for Strategic Competition, as well as Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He previously served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, also fulfilling the duties of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. And before his State Department service, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a great pleasure, and thanks for the kind introduction, Michael. Hello, everybody. It is great to have you all tuning in to this discussion. As you've heard, sponsored by the Washington Foreign Law Society and the Stimson Center. As Michael noted, I'm Chris Ford, and it's my pleasure to guest host today. But more importantly, I'm delighted we've got the blessing both of an international topic of enormous interest and importance, and also, best yet, of some really thoughtful people with whom to discuss it. This is, of course, the latest in a series of webinars on cyber norms, international law, and accountability in cyberspace. And I understand this is also going to be, these discussions will be forming part of a broader Stimson cyber initiative to promote progress in addressing international cyber risks, an area in which the private sector, think tanks, and civil society all have really important roles to play, in addition to governments and international institutions. I guess it's probably no longer the case that we can refer to cyberspace as a new domain, but there is still relatively little by way of an international structure of rules and norms here. There's not nothing, in fairness. Government in the form of what's known as the Budapest Convention. And in the international law arena more broadly, UN-sponsored groups of governmental experts have done some important work in at least starting to spell out understandings of legal and normative frameworks for the cyber domain. But we've got a key question that we're looking at here today, and that is the one of what more, if anything, might be possible, specifically on issues related to whether there's a way to help cope with the problem of cyber attack attribution, which is coming to the fore as a first order concern, not just for statesmen and security officials, but for private sector commercial actors of various sorts. The best illustration of this that I'm aware of, at least so far, can be seen with the infamous Russian NotPetya cyber attack on Ukraine in 2017, which was a pretty dangerously indiscriminate weapon, initially aimed at Ukraine's civilian critical infrastructure, and of course, a premonition of things to come, but also that ricocheted around the global internet, causing billions of dollars in damage and sparking litigation over how to interpret things like war exclusions, as they're called, in insurance coverage. And I think a lot of that is still being fought out in US courts. And that's just one example, but it does illustrate how important these challenges of cyber attack attribution can be, not merely as matters of national security and foreign policy, but also for the integrity and smooth operation of international trade and commerce and other aspects of the global economy. And so that frames our question today. What can we do, if anything, to address challenges and take advantage of opportunities that are related to cyber attribution to help commercial, financial, insurance, and other private sector actors operate better in a marketplace that's plagued by the costs and burdens of cyber attack and cyber damage mitigation and recovery? So it's a special pleasure to welcome the three terrific experts we've asked to come and help enlighten us on these things. Emma Refre is Chief Research and Analysis Officer with the CyberPeace Institute. John Herring is Senior Government Affairs Manager for the Digital Diplomacy Team at Microsoft. And Rick Harris is Principal Cybersecurity Policy Engineer at the MITRE Corporation, where I also work, and an advisory board member for the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. So we got a great crew of folks to help make us smarter on these challenging issues. What we, perhaps I'll do is give each of you in turn a chance to sort of frame the problem from your perspective. John, perhaps we'll start with you, sort of issues of how it is that cyber attacks can be characterized at all, and any other sort of perspectives that you'd like to put on the table to get us started. And then I'll turn probably to Rick for a description of something that is known as the MITRE attack framework. And I certainly know folks here at MITRE are very proud of that, but I'm guessing that there are some lay folks out there who maybe haven't heard about it. So perhaps you can demystify that a bit for us and suggest any potential relevance it may have here, and also offer any framing comments that you'd like to offer. And then I'll turn to Emma for the CyberPeace Institute's take on all of these things and the complexities of the attribution challenge. So I'm really looking forward to this myself. And after those initial framings, we will just sort of see where the conversation takes us, I suppose. I myself am looking very much forward to this ride. So once again, thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. Let's first hear from Microsoft's John Herring. John, if you don't mind, over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks so much to the organizers and hosts for putting this together. I think this really is where the conversation needs to be right now. I think to your point, Chris, it's probably not fair to say that it's a new domain of conflict at this point, but it's the newest domain of conflict in cyberspace, and certainly one that we are still reconciling with in terms of how to bring greater security and stability to that space. And to sort of start to build a deterrence framework where we can have people respect and adhere to expectations for responsible behavior, in particular responsible state behavior online, really hinges on having credible attribution. It's not like other domains of conflict where there's sort of immutable physical evidence in the wake of an attack. And there needs to be some ability for nations, for collections of nations, for the international community writ large to point to an attribution statement and have folks have trust and confidence in that and know that that can serve as the basis for consequences and responses following that. So that's an important place for the conversation to be, but getting to the basics of just what is a cyber attack, there's some different definitions for this, and I think different communities think about these things in different terms. There are many different kinds of cyber attacks that we can see from all kinds of different actors, and that's probably the best way to think about it. Is there's the attack and the incident itself, and then there is the actor that is responsible. And those attacks, they can target the ICT supply chain, or they can be much more targeted attacks. And you can think about poisoning the well of a particular type of technology so that everybody who is using it may potentially be infected with an attack, or something much more targeted at a particular adversary or some subnational target. Then there's also different kinds of malware. So what are you going to do in your particular attack? Is this a ransomware attack for profit? Is this spyware? Is this a wiper that is purely destructive in nature? Or is this, on the other side of the spectrum, something more based on influence and sponsoring a propaganda campaign? So I think I would encourage folks to think about this as having those two different elements. You've got the attacker on one side, which ranges from state-sponsored or just government-led cyber operations. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have just criminal organizations who are pursuing profit or some other illicit end. And then you can think about the attacks themselves as either being destructive or targeting the technology itself, where you'd be exploiting some weakness in the code or otherwise gaining access to harm someone's information or data. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you would have influence operations that are leveraging technologies to promulgate false information or to mislead audiences. And we can see a lot of this activity on display, and folks probably are familiar with activity, including all the way back to the NotPetya attack that you were referencing, Chris, and then current attacks that are already taking place in Ukraine as well, which has been such a hotbed for such a long time. When we think about attribution and understanding these attacks, a lot of that is based on what we refer to as techniques, tactics, and protocol or procedures, TTPs. This is the attacker behavior that we will observe. And so I won't get too deep into this, but I think from or at least right now, we can delve further later. The TTPs, this is what you might look at from a threat intelligence center. So you're sort of looking at the attacker activity across different platforms, and you're trying to say, okay, well, hey, what hours are these people working? That might tell you something about the geography where they are existing. What are some sort of common attack methods or approaches that they might be using, common code that they might be employing, common targets that they might be going after? These types of things constitute tools, tactics, and procedures that are, our defenders, both at Microsoft, in government agencies, other technology companies use to recognize common types of attacks. So I might leave that here as just an opening foray as to how we think about the threat landscape and why this discussion is important, and turn it over back to you, Chris.
Oh, that's great, Sean. Thank you for the framing. I guess to some extent, it almost feels to me like that the vocabulary is not adequate to this. I mean, I'm a lawyer who comes out of sort of the military and national security world, and when one says attack, you mean very specific things, killing people, blowing things up, and there's a framework that automatically applies once you start killing people and blowing things up. There, you've got lawyers who spend entire careers in law of war, operational, lawyering, and so forth. There are aspects of this for which that could be true, I suppose, but the range of challenges that you point to seems enormously broader, and I wonder whether we don't even have the language to start describing. And this is, it's awkward to talk about malicious cyber behavior or whatever else, but I'm not sure how you get more specific than that. That's fascinating. Thank you for that really helpful framing. Rick, how about we turn to you next, and help us understand your take on this, and perhaps, as I mentioned, the MITRE attack framework is as one of the pieces that is often talked of in sort of adjacent to the attribution world, although it may be not precisely the same. Help us understand that, if you could, and help lay the stage here for the rest of our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thanks to the host. It's a pleasure to be invited to this panel and have this discussion. I thought I'd start by just kind of building on John's remarks, particularly regarding TTPs and what that means in the context of the attack framework. So I want to level set the attack framework a little bit for those of you who may not be familiar with it. So first of all, attack framework stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. So it's really a model and a framework that was established in 2015, not necessarily to attribute actors, but to emulate or identify their behavior, their TTPs, kind of within a network. An attack was primarily built for network defenders, right? So network defenders to better understand, the network and the vulnerabilities in their networks, and then the things that they need to do in order to prevent disruption or prevent attacks against their networks. So as a primarily focused on the defender, it de-emphasizes as an outcome of using the attack framework attribution. But I think it's useful to think of attribution in a couple different perspectives, at least I do. I think about technical attribution, right, which is attribution related to the types of information that attack and the attack repository can organize, and it's organized around behaviors, it's organized around an attack life cycle, and it's organized around advanced persistent threats, right? Actual actors. But then there's this policy attribution piece that is different, I think, to some extent. It's supported by technical attribution, but fundamentally attribution at the policy level for governments is really a political decision. It can be supported or not by the technical details. And so it's also important to remember, I think, at least for me, that the attack really is a post-attack analysis. It can be used, it's very valuable, primarily for pre-attack preparation and planning for network defenders. And this post-attack analysis really occurs inside networks. So attack's really good, I think, at identifying what's going on inside networks. It's less good at identifying the contextual aspects that occur outside of a particular network. The attack framework's been around since 2015. I think that the likelihood that it can be or continue to be a tool and become more effective in contributing to kind of data-driven policy through its technical analysis, it will increase over time as the repository and the information on actors is built up, correlated, and codified. And it's also, I think, important to note that there has been significant uptake amongst security companies, industry, in the use of attack for their own internal analysis. And Chris mentioned insurance. I don't know that there's a lot of uptake in the insurance industry on using attack to play out kind of risk scenarios, but I think that's an area that attack is certainly suited for and can contribute to in the future. So thank you for this opportunity to talk and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Emma, how about your take on this to get us going?
Yeah, super. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And yeah, I think I want to take a slightly different angle, coming from the sort of civil society organization perspective. A lot of the work that we do is focused on reducing the harm on people. And so we're sort of looking at attribution from the accountability perspective. So in essence, how can we reach accountability by using attribution as one of the steps in that process? And how do we, through attribution and accountability, then allow for the remediation of victims or targets in the context of a cyber attack? And there's another thing also is how could we use attribution in terms of better understanding the threat landscape to be able to better support victims and targets within the pool of entities that we're supporting. So in terms of the work that we do at the CyberPeace Institute, we actually have a core focus, which is on documenting and tracking cyber attacks against certain communities. And we've done this in the context of the healthcare sector and also in the context of the ongoing armed conflict in Ukraine. And by documenting and tracking not just attacks, but also the attributions that have been done in the context of these different incidents, we're better able to understand how civilians are actually impacted by these attacks and who is posing the greatest threat. And where are these threats coming from? Are they coming from nation state actors? Are they coming from cyber criminal groups who are doing so for financial motives? And I'm sort of really jumping in here and overlapping with a lot of what John was saying in his introductions, that we're seeing different types of attacks, those of a destructive nature, those of a disruptive nature, those that are weaponizing data, and those that are being used to spread disinformation and build distrust in the community and society. So yeah, just as a brief introduction, I would say that I'm going to sort of take that angle today, and just also to clarify that at the Institute, we don't actually do attribution ourselves. And really the core of our work is looking at how we use information from third parties who are attributing attacks to be able to complete a better picture of the threats that are there today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. But you mentioned, Emma, that you all don't specifically do attribution. I guess, John, you all do. And actually, I didn't myself, thank goodness, no one wanted me to do that. But when I was at the State Department, my last few months there, the Office of the Cyber Coordinator reported to me, and they also did attribution from a policy perspective. But we did it somewhat differently in the sense that we cheated sometimes by having intelligence information to turn to. And I guess maybe I'll press you a little bit, John, on how it is that cyber sleuths actually do their attribution work when you don't have intelligence collection to add to the mix. It's one thing if you get lucky and see someone talking about having done an attack or that they're about to do an attack. That certainly makes the attribution piece somewhat less complicated. But you all are, in a sense, I'd imagine, in the business of building, I guess from a sort of legal perspective, might be thought of as kind of circumstantial evidence. Not that there's anything wrong with circumstantial evidence. Cases are closed all the time and quite properly on the basis of that. But this is making the jump from the victim was stabbed with a knife to Jack stabbed the victim with a knife is that's an important conceptual jump. Love to hear more, if you don't mind, about how you all do that and how you think people should think about what is, in a sense, a probabilistic call in that regard, and how do we frame that discussion in a way that's really useful.
It's a really wonderful question, Chris. And I think it's a really important one, because there's all kinds of different attributions that take place nowadays, and people should be able to sort of differentiate between what each community is able to say. As Emma rightly pointed out, there's different kinds of attributions as it relates to what you can know and what you're able to say. So from our perspective, there's technical attributions, there's legal attributions, and there's political attributions. And for Microsoft's part, we're able to see that first sliver pretty well. We are limited to the slice of the internet that we're able to observe, but it is a fairly robust slice, just given the different platforms that Microsoft manages. And so we're able to do a lot to identify, technically speaking. So it's not it's speculative. It's certainly grounded in fact. What has taken place, and where can we say conclusively that we see we can make an attribution to a particular attacker. That is different than being able to take the next political step that government agencies with intelligence resources can take to say, hey, it was done by this particular government for this particular purpose, and there needs to be this particular consequence. So what we're able to do is just to make that technical determination about where an attacker is located, and sort of what broader context this fits into in terms of their technical activities. And how we make those determinations is based on a combination of three different things. The first is just the observed malicious activity matching up with known patterns of behavior. So again, getting back to that TTPs, those tactics, do we see those being replicated by that same actor in other spaces? And so we can sort of say, okay, well, that's pretty consistent. And then is that observed activity consistent with the objectives of that attacker group that we've previously identified? And to the degree to which we can make that assertion, that can be quite compelling. And then finally, and this is quite important, are others seeing this the same way? Are others in the community of defenders also able to corroborate the things that we're witnessing on our platforms? Again, because we are limited in terms of the actual slice of the internet that we're actually able to observe. It is not a perfect science here in terms of how much each of those three elements needs to be evidenced in each case where we're making a technical attribution, but those are the three components that go into this work from a technology perspective, for us to say, hey, it is a group operating out of X geography for X purposes. And then we would obviously leave it to others to make more specified accusations in terms of who the actual individuals behind those keys were.
Right. And Rick, from your perspective, working with the MITRE attack framework, I mean, a lot of what you're describing focuses upon ex ante security and preparedness. I mean, I don't know whether there's a good analog to this, but I think of you want to make sure your building is appropriately safe for your work. I'm here in a MITRE office tower, for example. I assume that there are fire inspectors and OSHA occupational inspectors and all sorts of folks who, at some point or another, will have visibility into how things are set up here, and will that'll go into the calculation of whether this is a viable way to build a building and put people in it and so forth. MITRE attack seems to be more in that mode, rather than more in the fire safety inspection mode than in the mode of being an arson investigator. But to what extent do you think things like attack or frameworks of this sort can be useful in or used to support because the attack framework is one of the few that I'm aware of as sort of generally applicable frameworks for thinking about these challenges that I even put on the website myself and was looking through the drop-down windows of effects and remediations and so forth, which mostly didn't mean much to me. But for folks who are in this business, it's universally accessible as a standard. But to what way, in what ways, if at all, do you think that framework or things like it can contribute to the attribution world in helping level set expectations and understandings across the attribution community, as such as it is?
Well, I think one of the most important things, thanks for that question, but one of the most important things about attack is its relative transparency, right? It's available to anybody. Many of the contributors are industry themselves, so I think it does a good job of kind of correlating what different security vendors are seeing in different networks kind of across the ecosystem. Again, it's not perfect because the contributors may not be as comprehensive as you'd like to see them. But it does to some extent provide this kind of public forum for the reconciliation of observations about attackers and how and the techniques that they use. So there's a normalization of APT numbers and the naming conventions that different security companies use, and I think it's very useful for network owners and operators to understand. And so I think your analogy of the kind of the analogy of the kind of safety inspector, or at least providing tools for folks to test their fire alarms and test their locks, is pretty good from and related to the kind of best practice use of attack. And what it does, I think, is just further the knowledge of defenders and what's going on with their networks and how they can best defend them. There's some limitations, right? There's some levels of uncertainty. And one of the aspects of the uncertainty that I think is really important to the accountability question is that many of the tactics and techniques identified in the attack lifecycle can be used for multiple intents, and it's difficult to determine what the intents are. It could be destructive intents. It could be intelligence, espionage, intelligence gathering. They could be stealing intellectual property. It could be just simply establishing a presence for some future unknown action. So that's the tough part. And attack helps with that, but it doesn't have the final answer. And hopefully over time that level of uncertainty and the ferreting out of kind of intent will be more kind of qualitative or quantitative than qualitative.
Fair enough. I'll turn to Emma for a moment before I start to weave in some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. I was very struck by your comment about working with communities that are particularly affected by cyber mischief of various sorts and so forth. And I guess I'd like to ask you a capacity building question there. I mean, sensitizing communities to cyber need is critical. And I was sort of wondering about your thoughts on, well, I mean, sorry, let me back this up. One of the things that we were starting to do at the State Department or already doing to some degree when I was still there was cyber capacity building with international partners, helping make them better stakeholders and sort of better prepared for cyber challenges and whatever else it may be. That work has been continuing apace, and I think is really important in the international arena. But I guess one could also think about it much more broadly in terms of your perspective on which communities, sectors, institutions are most in need of help, and matching that up against the areas that are potentially most harmful from the perspective of society and the economy, if those needs are unaddressed. How should we be thinking about capacity building assistance? Who should be providing it, and how do we, what's currently done? Help us think through the sort of the remedial side of this from almost a community organizer perspective, if you will.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's a good question, actually. I mean, from our perspective, in terms of the priority communities per se that we service, the primary one is humanitarian non-governmental organizations. So they face particular challenges with regards to the cyber threats that they face because of the nature of the data that they process, but also in terms of the types of activities that they do and the boots on the ground that they have in a number of different regions in the world. And the second one that we focus on is the healthcare sector, but particularly during the pandemic and the number of cyber attacks that sector faced meant that we needed to look into how can we better protect the healthcare sector from cyber threats. And the third one that we're looking at is vulnerable communities related to conflict zones and really looking at what is happening in the context of the war in Ukraine. And in terms of capacity building, I mean, there's a number of different entities who can come into play here. But what we are finding is that for humanitarian actors, for example, there is a big gap between what is affordable in terms of cybersecurity and being able to increase their cyber resilience and their internal resources to be able to take in any recommendations for cyber resilience as well. So as an institute, we actually provide free services to NGOs by partnering up with the private sector to be able to ensure that we can increase their resilience and preparedness in the case of an attack. But I also sort of wanted to jump in on a couple of points that John and Rick mentioned around attribution, because there's some things that we're sort of thinking about in terms of the collection of the data. And I wanted to jump in with John because we are looking obviously at the technical, the legal, and the political attribution of attacks. And we've actually created our own category beyond that, which is self-attribution. And it's those threat actors out there today, notably in the context of Ukraine, but we've been seeing this with ransomware, for example, for a number of years now, is those actors who are quite happy to go out there and claim responsibility for an attack. And even though there is an important need for technical attribution to follow from there, there is a very urgent need for us to be able to capture that information in order to understand the actors who are operating in that space today and that are causing harm without waiting the time that it would take for a technical or political attribution to be done, which is something that we're all aware can take, a matter of weeks, months, and in some cases years. And just to give you a bit of an idea on the data that we've collected in terms of attacks against organizations in Ukraine, we've documented 203 attacks to date, and 56 of these actually have technical attribution that's been done by different entities, be it private entities, be it certs, or be even investigative journalists that are coming in now and starting to conduct technical attributions in that respect. But in terms of legal attributions, which are going to take much, much longer, we've only seen 2 attacks and 7 for political attribution. So there is this notion of how do we actually look at other classifications of attribution? And this comes back to definitions, right? And the use of terminology. Do we even consider that a type of attribution in terms of when a threat actor claims some kind of responsibility, or is this something different? So just a little something to shake up the conversation as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. And we've got a number of questions coming in. There's one that is that first came in on institutionalization of the attribution function, but I'm going to put that on pause just for a moment because what you just said, Emma, puts me in mind of pivoting to another question that came in first. So, and that's going to be, I'm going to combine a couple here in the sense that your comment about self-attribution also raises, at least implicitly, the question of misattribution. The idea that one could masquerade as someone else or adopt someone else's TTPs. Indeed, you can sort of find out whose TTPs are, what the TTPs are by going to your convenient MITRE attack framework, I suppose, Rick. So how does one deal with, any of you to jump in on this, the challenge of masquerading attackers, and also the challenge of proxies, where it actually is me that's behind this, but I really think that I would rather have Rick stick his neck out and go do this, so that I can have some degree of deniability here. How do you deal with these issues of I take your point about self-attribution, and I suppose to the degree that's genuine, it makes it easier in that particular narrow case, but I'm sure there's lots of gamesmanship out here and repurposing of TTPs and whatever else it may be. How does the community deal with these challenges? Anybody wants to jump in, please do so. And then I'll get back to institutionalization.
And actually, maybe the response to that leads into the other. Just to say first that I think it's there's a tendency to think about things in cyberspace as being unique or especially novel. But the idea of a false flag attack, has existed across all domains of conflict. And so it is not in many ways, hyper unique or specific to cyberspace. In terms of being sure that you are getting it right, that's where that corroboration piece, I think, becomes especially important. And in particular, when you start talking about attributing nation state attacks, and when governments are leading those attributions, making sure that they're not just pulling from their own intelligence and information resources, but like corroborating that with partners as well. And that's why it's been so encouraging to see, I think the 2 biggest innovations and advancements in government-led cyber attributions, or at least public statements, in the past decade have been, one, speed, improving how quickly they do this. You referenced the NotPetya attack, Chris, at the outset here. It took 8 months to attribute. Compare that to the US attributing the recent Iranian attacks against Albania, which was less than 8 weeks. So a lot of improvements in that speed.
I think in 2020, we actually gave advance attribution of a cyber attack, if I recall. It didn't ultimately occur, but we actually got some indications that bad things were happening. And there was a multi-government statement that we put out sort of saying, hey, watch out for this. We think there's something bad coming here, even in advance of the thing occurring.
And I actually think when we start talking about building credibility behind attribution statements, that's our next critical building block, is how transparent can you be with the underlying sources that you're basing that attribution decision on. And certainly in the run up to the conflict in Ukraine, being able to be transparent about, hey, here's what we're seeing already, here's what we anticipate to see, did a lot to strengthen intelligence claims or to undermine any perceived legitimacy of some of the aggressive actions that was taking place before then. But to your question about having confidence in these statements, the other big step forward has been corroboration with other partners over the last few years. And so while we would have seen previously governments say, hey, we think it was this actor that was responsible for this, we have high confidence, we have low confidence. Now it's not just one government coming out and saying that. You'll see, the US come out and say it, and then a dozen or so other partners and allies saying we also have reached this conclusion as well, which can go a long way to making sure that we're not getting it wrong.
Yeah, if anyone wants to jump in on that, please feel free, and then I'll turn to the other question.
Yeah, thanks. Just very, very quickly, I think there is masquerading or false flags, that can be designed into an attack, right? Or it can be a self-inflicted wound to some extent. You talked about NotPetya, originally, at least, in the public, identified as a ransomware attack that it became evident over time that it was actually a destructive attack. And so sometimes the speed and the rapidity in which we want to engage, politically, for instance, will lead us down potentially erroneous attribution decisions. So there's design masquerade, which I think is possible given the complicated nature of the internet and connectivity, and the common use of TTPs by multiple different actors. But then there's also how do we need to keep ourselves from the self-inflicted wound of misattributing certain activities.
And I'll jump in there. I mean, also the dangers of misinterpreting an attribution and misunderstanding one is, how quickly that can lead to escalation in cyberspace, but also in the real world, right? So a cyber attack leading to a potential threshold of a breach of international law can lead to real world repercussions very quickly. So I think that it's very important for us to consider in how far a wrong attribution can also lead to some very severe problematics. And I really hear John also on the notions of some of the complexities in attribution in relation to what needs to be done from a corroboration perspective. So one of the things that we're looking at when we're documenting the data in which we've got associated attributions, for example, what we would call self-attribution at this stage, is what other corroborating information is out there. So looking, for example, at website monitoring sites that would indicate the downtime of a website in the sense of a DDoS attack. We'd also be looking at conflicting information. So we've seen different threat actors, for example, publishing data dumps following a ransomware attack. And there are conflicting information. Do they both have access? Who committed the attack? So these kind of things are also very important for us in understanding, are there potentially multiple actors involved in a single attack, depending on the phases of when that happened. So one of the examples that I'm thinking of is an attack on a psychotherapy clinic in Finland, where there was a data breach. Data was exfiltrated, and then a significant amount of time later, that data resurfaced, and there was a series of different ransom demands that were made. But how do we actually know at this stage that the actors that were involved in the first stage of exfiltration and those that actually did the dumping of the data were actually one and the same? And these sorts of assumptions need to be very clearly laid out and be very careful around those types of attributions.
Especially in the context of clandestine markets for data that's taken in that fashion, right? To the degree that things that are stolen are commoditized, that creates additional linkages between initial bad actor and ultimate bad actor, I guess. That's interesting. Yeah. So let me ask a question in general about sort of institutionalizing things, and I can give sort of in two contexts. The question came in in the sense of asking about what role, if any, could be imagined for international institutions, some kind of an attribution organ or forum or whatever it may be. So I want to sort of get your all's take on that, but also to use that is a sort of second piece of the question to pivot to some of the sorts of things that the questions that would help inform this Stimson Center project moving forward on cyber governance. And to what degree are there ways to institutionalize in the broadest sense common expectations of best practices and standards and ways to think about attribution, so that at least we can level set a broader community on how to think about this, what constitutes a sort of understood best practice way to do that, and in a sense, what doesn't, right? So any of those aspects would be great, but why don't we start with just the issue of institutions per se, and then just pivot in a more concrete sense and pivot to the broader question of how to institutionalize frameworks of thought and understandings of what should or could be done in this area. Any order you like, jump in.
I can kickstart it if you want, in terms of the notion of a body for attribution. I mean, there's pros and cons with regards to this debate, and a few that we sort of try to conceptualize. So one is a significant potential negative is that really any kind of body that would be developed would need to be mandated by a treaty, and how much time would it take to put that in place? And then associated to that is, how do we build capabilities, including the understanding of a geopolitical context relating to this? And when we think again about false flags, for example, as was brought up in the conversation earlier, is how do we ensure a wide variety of capabilities are fitting into this particular organization? And then there's the question of whether states would actually support an NGO, a non-governmental organization, actually taking part in this with regards to governance structure. How much backing are we likely to get from states to be able to create this kind of organization? And then really there's also this thought about, if we were to create an attributing body of this kind, does this body need to necessarily make the attributions of attacks public? And the question around this is, the geopolitical sensitivity of a lot of this, and in how far making attribution statements public might actually make things extremely difficult from a geopolitical context. But could there be a middle ground where actually attributions don't necessarily make it into the public space? And so that was sort of some of the questions on sort of the negative side. On the positive side, it was certainly build independence and transparency in relation to attribution, and it would also allow for a body to develop and standardize sets of frameworks or procedures for attribution that would be recognized by the member states of that body, for example. And then there's also the notion that if it is mandated by a treaty, then that organization holds a strong sense of credibility. So just, hand over to someone else who wants to follow up.
Yeah,
great thoughts. I mean, if I might, your comment on the implications of an attribution call is certainly very well taken. We're the last few days in the international in the kinetic arena, we've seen with the explosions that killed 2 people in southern Poland. Very dramatic questions and issues hang on who is responsible for what, and that's that can be no different in the cyber arena. I'm sure. It's not just geopolitical consequences; it's potentially commercial consequences. I think I recall reading someplace that President Obama very carefully did not describe the Sony Pictures attack as being an act by the North Korean government, even though everyone pretty much understood that it was. Not because he didn't think it was, but because if he used those words, it might trigger insurance exception liability problems for Sony Pictures. So there are lots of potential consequences here in the nuclear verification arena, about which I have some, in which I have some professional background. There's a sort of an implied dividing line between what people are willing to entrust to a technocratic international body, the IAEA, for example, and what they are not. And they are willing to entrust very discrete technical determinations as to whether or not the safeguards agreement for country X is being adhered to this body. But countries have not been willing to entrust bigger picture geopolitical calls about who is in violation of the NPT for trying to build nuclear weapons in violation of its Article 2, right? So some things seem to work and be entrustable to organizations, and some things, at least if you take that example, are not. So I don't know if that helps frame this at all. But sorry, Rick, I did cut you off. My apologies.
Oh, no worries. I don't have a lot to say on this, but from a best practices standpoint in attributing, the US has a high bar, right, for determining sanctions that, incorporates a lot of information, public and private information on attribution and who's should be held accountable. That's at the kind of national level. The international level, you have, I think about law enforcement, right, Interpol and the joint investigations that occur with members of Interpol and identifying specific actors or cyber criminals in particular. But it seems to me that a purpose-built international organization would run into lots of problems, as you've just kind of articulated. But the existing organizations under their current mandates could be configured to at least start identifying consensus around attribution. I think about the G20, for instance, or multilateral organizations that nationally they have the means to identify and can share information and have the means to identify and attribute actors, but then they also have the kind of political forum to demonstrate their consensus and come out, and identify an actor and come out in support of kind of rules of behavior and things like that. So I would try to focus more, I think, on existing organizations and leveraging their current mandates.
I'm actually finding myself, you mentioned law enforcement. I mean, despite the conventional wisdom that attribution is so terribly challenging, we actually do have law enforcement folks make attribution calls in effect quite frequently. Indictments from our Department of Justice, for example, against cyber hacker sorts of folks in foreign government intelligence services and things of that nature. And that's in a context in which, at the end of the day, they shouldn't and couldn't, and I don't think do. They don't make those calls and issue indictments, for example, unless they really think that they can bear the burden of proof, which in the criminal context is very high. So someone thinks they can make a reasonable doubt standard with whatever they have brought into their attribution mix. So there's presumably a very high degree of confidence there and a willingness to, at the end of the day, be public about that and to subject it to accountability and cross-examination in a criminal trial in the, admittedly unlikely event that, Chinese PLA officers or Russian GRU folks are ever turned over to justice there. But so someone thinks these things work really well. Do you guys have any visibility into sort of what the decision calculus is in those kinds of attributions? I realize I may be asking the wrong crew of non-govies, but that strikes me as a fascinating analogy. And also, I want to make sure we don't fail to hear from John on institutionalization if there's something he wants to say.
So nothing on the most recent question, but on institutionalization, I might echo most of what Emma and Richard were saying. Just to put it quickly, I think do we need more sources of authority when it comes to attributing attacks? Yes. On a long enough timeline, will that hopefully look like something approximating an IAEA for cyberspace when it comes to nation state activity online? I think something that is at least replicating the responsibilities of that organization in that space would eventually make a lot of sense. But I think, to put it quite simply, it's a pretty small club of countries that are currently participating in advanced cyber operations, and they are the countries you would expect across geopolitical fault lines. And so when you start talking about how to build an immutable international body that might be able to call balls and strikes there, I think that gets pretty tricky. What we could do, I think, which is what Richard was speaking to, is start working through organizations like the G20, like other existing institutions, to start at least agreeing on, what's the recipe for a good high quality attribution? What should be included in that process? How can states, work together to make them more robust? What should the expectations be for that process, so that people can have more confidence in the attribution process as it currently exists, and start moving towards something that hopefully has a little more robustness to it. And then also to Emma's point, making sure that this includes a lot more than just hey, here's the actor who did it and here's what the incident was, but capturing some of that broader context as an expectation in attribution statements around, well, who was harmed? What was the actual impact of this attack? If it's the same attacker that's been responsible for previous attacks, let's talk about a cumulative attribution for that particular incident, so that we're having a more complete conversation. At the end of the day, that's what a public attribution statement should do, is seek to inform a broader audience and partner governments about, well, what's just happened. And then perhaps most importantly, did this violate any international expectations, which is something we have extremely rarely ever seen included in attribution statements. Is, okay, you attacked the thing. Did that violate any expectations that we currently have? And it's interesting to see folks stop short of that so frequently.
Yeah, and then the process of articulating what expectations are ex ante is pretty critical, right? I mean, that was one of the reasons why I thought it was so useful. I think there was a UN GGE in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, that articulated a peacetime norm, or several of them. But the one that I thought most interesting was the articulation that, hey, it's really not cool to attack civilian critical infrastructure in peacetime, which is an additional step beyond simply articulating what they had in 2013, that the law of war would apply in a cyber conflict just as it applies in a kinetic conflict. But you can't complain that someone has violated that expectation unless you have had the guts to articulate the expectation in the first place. So no, I take your point. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to ask one more question and then give each of you all the chance to give any sort of closing remarks to leave people with, especially in view of this sort of broader project of that Stimson's engaged in to try to move the ball forward in some fashion on how to approach attribution issues and cyber governance issues in general in a more constructive and productive way. So the final question, I guess, has to do with, I'm going to reframe it, but it came in from a law professor, so I don't want to put it in those terms, but we've talked about attribution from the perspective of who the bad actor is who did a thing, but there are other ways to also be a bad actor and to be, in a sense, culpable in this context. And by analogy to the kinetic world, I mean, I might be a nasty terrorist who attacks your country, but I'm not the only one at fault if indeed the country in which I am taking safe harbor and that sort of protects and coddles me, or at least fails to respond to everyone else's entreaties that they rein me in. There can be a degree of culpability for a failure to prevent as well, at least in those contexts. To what degree can we talk of that in the cyber arena? Now, let's say everyone attributes a whole pile of nasty things to cyber attackers in Russia. And does so publicly, and diplomats complain about this, and it keeps happening and keeps happening. At what point, even if we can't close the loop evidentiarily to the GRU or something, can we say, look, this is a Russia problem, and it's not just a Russians problem? Talk about geopolitical consequences. Yeah,
there's a lot of irony in that UN negotiations of a new cybercrime treaty were kicked off by a Russia-sponsored resolution just in this past year.
That's because they hate the Budapest Convention, because it talks about things like respect for human rights and the need to cooperate against endemic cybercrime.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that, and then there's certainly been concerns from that community around the Budapest Convention. But to your point, I do think. Lost the thread of the conversation. Responsibility to prevent. I mean, at what point are you guilty also because you have you've not acted against the bad actors? The first step there, I think, is going to be citing the expectation that was violated, perhaps by a government body or a government sponsored organization. And so, encouragingly, I think there's been two recent examples of at least the U.S. starting to dip a toe into that space. The first was remarks by President Biden last year, which was around talking about Russia, saying they have due diligence responsibilities under those norms from the UN that you just cited, to be taking responsibility for bad actors that are operating within their own borders. So when we see a significant attack that downs critical infrastructure in the US or elsewhere attributed to actors in Russia that are identifiable, there's an obligation there. They should be taking action against those actors, whether or not they are directly aligned or supported by or have any affiliation whatsoever with the government. The other most recent example of this was in the most recent U.S. attribution statement from back in September, which, as I sort of mentioned previously, for the first time highlighted which expectations were violated. And it had to do specifically with an attack on civilian critical infrastructure, saying that this attack by Iran on Albania violates this international norm. And I think that needs to be a precursor to any further step or actions in holding the governments themselves responsible when it is a state-sponsored or state-accepted cyber incident.
Interesting. Anything else on that from the others, please?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly on that. I think it goes back to what you said previously about circumstantial evidence, right? And a consensus around who around attribution, and then the responsibility of the nation or state who is the source, whether they're culpable or not, is the source of the activity to actually do something about it, which the non-binding norms from the GGE actually seem to require. And so I think it's really a matter of, from what you said earlier, of building a consensus around the thresholds for international organization action statements as well as national actions, and this common framework and taxonomy for attributing but then doing something about it.
Yeah, and I'll sort of just jump in there really in terms of attribution and how important it is to identify the actual actors in this context, the type of actor, the type of attack, and the motive of the attack. But when looking at all this is how much does the state control those actors? And it's important to be able to understand the state control over those individuals or those groups who are acting out of that nation state. Because that could bring into questions the threshold of an attack under international law and the UN Charter, which then could bring in a whole other area of looking into the responsibility of the state in the context of those. So perhaps just another perspective.
That's fascinating. And issues of capacity, not trivial there either, I suppose, right? I mean, it would not be hard to imagine that whatever responsibility to prevent there may be is one that is contextual enough that you would look at it differently if there were an attack originating in, you could show originated in, I don't know, Somalia, present day Somalia versus, Shanghai. Those are very different contexts. And I suppose you would be justified in inferring very different things about the degree to which such things are tolerated or even approved of by authorities if they keep happening in one versus the other. Very interesting. So I want to give you all a chance in our last couple of minutes. Any final comments, especially to kick us off down the road of helping inform and set some understandings and guidance for this Stimson project on how to make all of this better in some fashion? What should we keep in mind? What do you want to make sure we don't forget? Please, Rick, you got your hand up. Go for it.
Very quickly. I think we have to think really hard about what either the collective we or the individual stakeholders in this business have to gain from attribution. What do we have to gain? What's the advantage of attribution? And then work toward identify ways to actually achieve those aims. But we have to some extent, ask ourselves that first order question. So thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate.
I understand they're also going to be spending some time looking at, in a sense, history and other domains, in the sense of how have frameworks of normative expectations or indeed legal rules evolved in other contexts. What has gone into that? What lessons can we draw, or what lessons should we not try to import from those contexts? That sounds like a very interesting project. John or Emma, what would you like to add as a closer, if anything?
I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still in the cyber attribution world, and a lot of that comes down to the statement itself that is released, and the degree to which we can make those much more predictable, much more standardized, much more consistent, both from the technology industry when we're putting out our statements, as well as from government bodies when they're putting out their statements. I think that will do a lot to help reinforce international expectations and lay the groundwork for a more robust deterrence approach to reckless particular state behavior in cyberspace. on the part of governments, that can look like more transparency in terms of, hey, what's the underlying information that's corroborating this particular statement? This can look like more coordination with other governments. It can also look like retroactive transparency, which I think would be an interesting and novel approach here as well, which is to say, completely understandable that sources and methods behind a particular attribution might not be something that can be readily disclosed at the time of the attribution statement, but perhaps months or years down the line, we could revisit that and say, hey, here's actually how we arrived at that conclusion. So you at least would be demonstrating a little bit more about a robust process that goes into place for arriving at such conclusions. From the technical community side, I think we're doing a better job, at least, I'll speak for Microsoft. We release now, frequently not just attributions, but a technical breakdown of the attack, as well as then a policy-based analysis of where we're sort of assuming this responsibility is lying for the attack itself.
And I'll just go very quickly, given the time. Yeah, I'll just go with John on this about standardization, but I also want to talk about reproducibility and in how far attribution can actually be reproduced by an independent expert, an independent party, and looking how we can use peer review processes for this. And really ensuring that any attribution that is done and that leads to future action is actually independent of commercial or geopolitical objectives as well. So yeah. And then really one final phrase is really how attribution can be used as one piece of the puzzle to help to increase stability in cyberspace overall.
Tremendous. I have every expectation that you guys have really helped jumpstart this project to a good end. My own impression of these areas is that the mere fact of discussing and trying to articulate expectations and best practices is itself really critical. And I think it sounds like that's something on which we can all agree. It sounds like we are already helping to move things down the road towards really properly thinking through whether some improvements might be possible in that respect. Can we get stakeholders to come together better, to do more, to discuss and develop and articulate those kinds of expectations and standards and ways to approach this stuff? And can we pivot from there, in fact, to helping build a better community of trying to hold people to those expectations and employ them usefully? This is really cool. We haven't answered all these questions today, but I am really delighted we've been able to discuss them, and very much so that we've been able to discuss them with three such terrific presenters and discussants. Thanks also to all the questions that came in. I'm sorry we couldn't take all of them, but this is a really rich vein, and I'm pleased that we got as far as we did. I myself have really enjoyed being part of this. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that the same is true for all of the listeners out there listening. So I hope maybe just virtually clapping, but if we could please join me thanking the panelists as well as the Washington Foreign Law Society and Stimson for putting all this together. Fantastic stuff. I really appreciate all of you being part of this. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving, and wish you all the best. Thanks so much for being part of this.
And thank you so much, Chris, for moderating this terrific program. It's been truly a pleasure and an honor. Let me just remind folks that the program will be put on our YouTube page and on the website. So if folks missed bits of it, they'll be able to catch it again. And obviously follow us for more great programs. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.